series. It's been going on for a while. And Best and Bermuda College have been working together to bring environmental topics to the public and to raise awareness about each of them. We are hybrid now, so we also have people online listening in. So if you are listening in and you have questions, you can email Dr. Sarah Smith afterwards, and we'll provide you with that email. Or you can email me, aharvey@college.bm, and I can connect you with Dr. Sarah Smith. But just to introduce our guest speaker, which we're very grateful to have. She's visiting our beautiful island on sabbatical, and Dr. Sarah Smith is a fisheries social scientist and marine research associate with the University of Rhode Island's Coastal Resources Center, as well as a visiting assistant professor at the University of Rhode Island. Her current work is focused on supporting sustainable fisheries, practicing in low and middle income countries to promote food security and livelihoods for coastal communities. So without further ado, because we want to hear what she has to say, thank you so much. We appreciate you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Amy. Thank you to Beth and to the college for having me.
I was just wondering about closing the door.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So again, my name is Sarah Smith. I'm a lot of stuff up here. I'm normally based at the University of Rhode Island in the US. But as Amy said, I'm here in Bermuda for most of the year. So I've been here now 8 months or so. So I've been mostly still working kind of on issues outside of Bermuda though. So today I'm going to mostly be talking kind of in a global context, and I'll talk about some case studies of some of the things that I've done. I'm really interested in what's going on in Bermuda, but we can talk about that a little bit, but just, my context is more going to be kind of from a global perspective and talking about, some of the different places that I have been working around the world. So just kind of as an overview, a general overview of, just an overview of the talk. I'm going to be talking just first kind of about fisheries. And by fisheries, I mean fisheries includes sort of the fish themselves and the fishing activity and the fishers, the fishermen, sort of all of the activity that goes around fishing, the process of getting fish, sort of from the water to people's plates. That's sort of how we would define fisheries. So I'm going to kind of talk about, why that's important in a number of different contexts. I'm going to talk about the importance of fisheries management. So managing fisheries, which includes managing both the fish and managing the activity of fishing people. I'm going to then talk about climate change in the ocean, kind of give a general overview of climate change, and talk a little bit about some of the impacts that climate change is having on fisheries around the globe. I'm going to provide some case studies and talk about sort of what's happening in a few different regions of the world. And then I'm going to talk a bit about kind of adapting to climate change and kind of how fisheries can address climate change. So, first is a little bit of background. As Amy mentioned in her introduction, I'm a fisheries social scientist. It is sort of what I call myself. So what that means exactly is that, some of the questions that I'm interested in, as a professional and in my research is really thinking about kind of the human side of fishing. So we would call fishing and fisheries a social ecological system, which means that it's made up of both the ecological side, the ecosystem, the fish and the habitats that they live in, as well as the people, both the people who do the fishing, the people who do the management, the people who eat the fish. So part of my interest is really understanding kind of the human side of fisheries. So that includes questions like, how do people understand and perceive fisheries and the marine environment? Sort of how do they understand that? What do they think about climate change? And then, critically for thinking about managing fisheries, the question is really, How do people respond to policies and regulations? So, if we're thinking about managing fisheries, managing fish stocks, we can create all sorts of different policies and regulations, but if people don't follow them, then they're not worthwhile, right? So part of what we need to think about is kind of the human side and how do people, think about and respond and understand and respond to different regulations on fishing. And then some of my more recent work has been focused on fisheries as sustainable development. So I've been based in an organization at the University of Rhode Island called the Coastal Resources Center. And part of what we do, it has been sort of promoting sustainable fisheries in different parts of the world as a means of sustainable development. So sustainable development meaning, allowing for countries or communities or places to develop, to grow, but in a sustainable way. So, without taking more than they need, and with allowing some fish to be there to replenish themselves. So, these questions, the questions that we look at are things such as how can fisheries be sustainably managed to support both food and livelihood? So thinking about, the importance of fish, not just as part of the ecosystem, but also as food and also as a source of livelihood to people around the world. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the places that are sort of the larger blue stars, or some of the places I'm going to be talking about today where I've been kind of working most recently. New England in the US, which is where I'm, based most of the time when I'm not here in Bermuda, the Philippines, the Pacific Islands, and Madagascar. But I've also done some work in a bunch of these other places. So that's just to say, I think, or I hope to think that I have a fairly broad global context. But all of this is sort of asking this question about how to manage fisheries sustainably in a way that benefits both people and the oceans. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of why fisheries are important globally and around the world. First, they're an important source of food. So fish provide a healthy protein source in terms of seafood, and an important source of micronutrients to consumers all over the world. There's more than 1 billion people in the world today who rely on seafood as their primary source of protein. And there are roughly 60 million people employed around the world in fishing and fish farming and aquaculture. And then probably roughly another 600 million people around the world who are dependent sort of indirectly on fisheries for their livelihoods, whether that's working in selling fish or processing fish or in some other way involved in fisheries. So fisheries, managing fisheries sustainably is very important for providing a sustainable source of food and for maintaining livelihoods in different parts of the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about food security, which, there's different sort of definitions of food security, but the main, sort of a common definition is providing people with physical and economic access to efficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences. So fisheries are an important source of global food security. This figure down at the bottom, which comes from the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, shows that fish and seafood are the second most important source of protein from animal sources after milk. So, again, people here in Bermuda eat, we eat a fair amount of fish, but it's, I think we have probably a different relationship. There's many other accessible sources of protein here in Bermuda, but that's not necessarily the case in a lot of the world. And a lot of the fisheries that I work on are what would be called small scale. So they're artisanal fisheries, maybe without an engine or a very small engine. These are people going out sort of, for the day fishing. And the vast majority of that catch, 90 to 95% of that fish is consumed locally. So we're really talking about fishing, for the primary purpose of feeding people. Just to talk about this a little bit further, the importance that fish have for food security. In addition to protein, fish are a very important source of micronutrients for people, things like iron, zinc, vitamins A, B, and D, omega-3s and selenium to billions of people around the world. There are people all over the world who are suffering from different types of nutrient deficiencies. And so fish can be an important way to kind of fill that gap. And some of these nutrient deficiencies cause problems such as anemia, childhood stunting, which is, essentially not growing rapidly enough, blindness, rickets. So that's just to say that fish, in thinking about fish, and this is, one of the many reasons why this is something that interests me, is because, thinking about how to kind of solve this problem of having sustainable amounts of fish for people to eat. It goes way beyond just thinking about kind of fish as part of the ecosystem, but thinking really about how fish can contribute to promoting global food security around the world. So in order to do that, in order to think about sort of food security and ensure that there is sufficient fish and seafood to provide for global food security, we need to manage our fisheries sustainably. So a lot of the work that I've done is really related to, thinking about fisheries management. And just kind of to give a quick primer on fisheries management, there's a quote that I really enjoy that from a guy named John Shepard, who said, managing fisheries is hard. It's like managing a forest where the trees are invisible and keep moving around. In other words, fisheries managers and scientists, part of their job is trying to understand how many fish there are in the ocean and how many can be taken out sustainably. It's, sort of similar to managing, for example, timber or forests or something else where we're managing a natural resource. But the essential challenge, one of the essential challenges with fisheries is it's very hard to ever know exactly how many fish are there to be taken sustainably, right? So it just makes this whole process of managing fisheries quite challenging from a number of different perspectives. And fisheries management, I mentioned at the beginning that, I'm a social scientist, so I think about people. Fisheries management, sort of the process of managing fisheries is really about thinking about who can fish, how much fish they can take out of the ocean, when they can go fishing, where they can go fishing, how often they can fish, what species they can fish for, with what kinds of gear. All of these questions are what fisheries managers, depending on kind of the context and where they are, these are some of the questions that fisheries managers are thinking about. And this really comes down to kind of thinking about allocation. So it's about allocating a certain amount of fish allocating fish among different interests. And some of that is, commercial fishing versus recreational fishing. How much fish should be for consumption? How much fish should be for recreational fishing? Thinking about, where I am from in the United States, there's many different types of fishing gear. So sometimes there's competition between different types of fishing gear. So thinking about how much fish should be allocated to those different types of gear. And then thinking about, the allocation between fishing and fish for consumption versus how much fish needs to be left in the ocean for conservation purposes, for promoting a healthy ecosystem, for boosting fish stocks into the future. So a lot of what fisheries management is really thinking about these allocation decisions about how much, kind of what our priorities and our values are as a society, and thinking about how to allocate the fish between kind of these different buckets or different uses. So that's just to say that fisheries management, at the end of the day, really, in my opinion, it's really about people. It's really about managing the people who are doing the fishing. We can't manage the fish. We can't tell them where to go. We can't sort of grow more fish on our own unless we're doing aquaculture. We're really managing kind of the human response to what's in the ocean in terms of what we take out of the ocean, how we take it out, and thinking about, how much we want to take versus leave in the ocean. And there's a number of different tools of fisheries management that we can use. So some of them are, what we would call output control. So that's thinking about kind of managing what's coming out of the ocean. So that might be quotas saying, you can take X number of pounds of fish or X number of lobsters. It might be size limits, which is saying, the fish all have to be at least, a certain size, or they can't be over a certain size. Or we also use what we would call input controls, which is sort of controlling the way that fishing is happening. And that might be restricting certain types of fishing gear. That might be seasonal closures. So closing areas, closing fishing at times that fish are spawning or reproducing. It might include things like marine protected areas. So closing off an area to fishing, to allow for stock replenishment. Those are all what we would call input controls. And so each of these, doing this fisheries management also requires data and information. So it requires having some data on, catches, sort of what's coming out, some measure of abundance of kind of what's there, to really be able to, for fisheries managers to really be able to understand kind of the health of the fish stock. So, thinking about fisheries management, and that's just kind of a really quick overview of how, what fisheries management is all about. The reason why this is important, in addition to what I kind of talked about before, this is a figure that is meant to show sort of the status of all fish stocks around the world. And I think, some of this is probably debatable, but what it shows is that bottom orange section is what we would call overfished. So those fish stocks have been fished too hard, their numbers are down, they're not, currently necessarily fishing on them may not be sustainable. The sort of big section in the middle is what we would call fully but sustainably fished. So they're not being overfished, but there's maybe not a lot of opportunity to fish harder on these fish stocks. And then this top section, which is increasingly small, and this only goes out to, this is a little bit of an older figure, it only goes out to 2015. Those are stocks that are not fully fished, meaning there's opportunity to kind of fish harder on those particular fish stocks and without danger of overfishing. So what this, what I want you to get out of this is really just understanding that the number of stocks that are overfished is growing, as is the number of stocks that are being fished. So sort of that opportunity for kind of finding new fisheries is really small. We're sort of, in a way, we're sort of like maxing out as a global society what we can do in terms of fishing. But of course, our human population is growing. So this figure, the orange shows fishing, wild harvest fishing, and the blue shows aquaculture. So what this is showing is basically we've come to sort of, almost like a steady state in terms of the level of wild harvest fishing that's taking place. And then the aquaculture side of producing seafood is taking off exponentially. So, at this point, we're at close to 50% of the seafood, that we consume globally is coming from aquaculture. And that's, to make up for, essentially part of that is kind of to make up for the inability to be able to find sort of new fish species to fish. And then finally, one kind of last point about thinking about fisheries management. So, this is all to kind of show you what the objective of fisheries management is. So fisheries managers, I talked about kind of some of the tools. Fisheries managers are needing to account for a number of different variables on fisheries. So they're not just thinking about, sort of the fishing activity, but they need to think about, from the ecological perspective, they need to think about recruitment patterns, which is, sort of how often the fish are reproducing. They need to think about habitat. They need to think about range shifts, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is fish sort of moving from one place to another. They need to think about the level of ocean productivity is going to affect, how well fish do. And then there's sort of all these other external factors that are going to be affecting, the fish and the success of fisheries management. And that might include, the existence of aquaculture, using things like offshore energy, consumer demand. So how much people actually want to eat a particular fish, temperatures, storms, all of these things are really really affect sort of the success of fisheries management. So that's to say, we can have all of these tools, we can have all of the best data in the world, but we're not necessarily going to be able to account for kind of all of these extra different factors in thinking about fisheries management, which is just to say it makes it quite complicated. And that leads me into sort of the next part of my talk, which is to talk about climate change and the effect that climate change is having on our oceans as kind of, a newer sort of frontier in thinking about how to manage fisheries. So I'm sure that many of you know that climate change is causing the oceans to get warmer. This figure here just, if you look at the lines, you can see the end of this graph is 2020. So it's, the red is sort of above global average temperatures over the decades. So it's just showing you essentially that the ocean is getting warmer. But what you may not realize, we sort of all know that the world is getting warmer because of climate change, but it's not sort of happening at the same rate or happening universally. So the oceans actually absorb about 90% of the excess energy from greenhouse gas emissions. So the oceans are warming a lot faster than sort of the air because the oceans absorb a lot of that extra carbon dioxide that's being produced. The top layer of the ocean so far has warmed about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And warming waters, in addition to the waters just getting warmer on their own, increasing water temperatures also contribute to sea level rise. As sort of the water warms, it actually expands, so that can contribute to sea level rise. And then warming waters will also melt ice sheets. As the water in the Arctic and the Antarctic get warmer, it will cause some melting, which will actually further sea level rise as we have, more sort of ice is turned into water. This figure shows some ocean heat trends from the last 2 decades or so. And what you can see, you don't need to fully understand this, but basically this is showing a change in temperature. So the areas that are redder have been getting warmer, and the areas that are bluer are getting colder. So again, it's not sort of universal that all of the ocean is experiencing the same thing at the same time. But generally there's a lot more red than blue, right? You can see there's a couple areas where the water is actually cooling, but that's not the predominant trend. And you can see there's some sort of hot spots, that areas that are sort of darker red. And you can see, around where Bermuda is, that it's definitely in the, not in a hot spot necessarily, but definitely, definitely getting warmer. And then this figure shows sort of projected warming towards the second half of this century. And it's, it's just sort of showing like differences in water temperature between, the last half of the 20th century versus the second half of the 21st century. What you need to know really is that the darker the area, the more rapidly it's expected to warm. So, pertinent to this, the area where I do most of my work in New England in the United States is, sort of very dark red is one of the areas that's experiencing the greatest amount of warming. And then ocean temperatures are not the only impacts that climate change has on the oceans, of course. There's also ocean acidification, coral bleaching, which you're probably all familiar with, marine heat waves. So that's, in addition to kind of prolonged heating, we have heat waves on land. There's also marine heat waves in the ocean where they might have sometimes they call it like a warm water blob, or they have a prolonged period with like extremely warm water. And that can have, that's more sort of a shorter time frame event, but that can have detrimental effects on fish, and it can cause things like harmful algal blooms. And then shifting ocean currents as well is something that can happen, as waters sort of warm. as sort of it can sort of change the dynamics of the ocean and might have some effects on the ocean currents themselves. So, how is this going to affect fish? So fish respond to changes in water temperature. They have sort of areas that they prefer, water temperatures that they prefer. Some fish favor a certain type of habitat, like reef fish. Other fish, which are, pelagic out in the open ocean, they're really responding much more to sort of the temperature. So all of this has caused and will cause some changes in the distribution and abundance of different fish species as they sort of move to follow their preferred water temperature. These changes may also have other impacts on fish and other types of seafood as well. It can affect growth rates. I saw a study recently that climate change is affecting the growth rates of fish, but it's not we're not seeing the same changes across all fish species. Some fish species are getting smaller as water gets warmer, and others might get bigger. So there's kind of a lot of unknowns about, some of these effects. But this climate change is affecting prey availability. So, if the thing that they like to eat is moving, it can affect sort of where their food is. It may affect their habitat with things like coral bleaching and other, affecting seagrass and affecting other types of habitat. And it can affect the timing of their spawning, which is usually cued by sort of the water temperature. Furthermore, ocean acidification has a particular effect on shellfish, affecting their ability to grow shells. Crustaceans, such as lobsters and crabs, may also be affected. And then the prey species of many of these fish, the fish themselves may not be affected by ocean acidification, but what they eat may be affected. And then just to note finally that, climate change and these effects are one of many stressors on fish. So there's many other things that are affecting, the health of fish stocks, and that may be pollution, that may be overfishing, that may be shipping, development, all sorts of things. So what we can expect, and there's a lot of unknowns about exactly what this will look like. But this figure, what you need to get out of this figure is basically the redder places are places where the total amount of fish is expected to decline. And the bluer places is where the amount of fish is expected to increase, more or less. So the thing that I want you to take away from this figure is that the redder places tend to be kind of concentrated more around the equator, towards the poles. Like in this particular study, and there's different variations on this in different studies, but this study shows, for example, Russia is going to be doing really well, at least for the near term, sort of the medium term. And just to understand that fish stocks are affected differently by climate change, right? So it's not to say all fish are going to decrease. Some may increase. Some places in the ocean will have, or some places in the world may have more fish as fish move. Some will have less. But this has significant implications for food security, particularly in the tropical regions, where we see, most of those sort of red areas. This is an article that came out a couple years ago in Science magazine. It shows these are anchovies, which is the world's largest fishery by sort of volume, that they may be affected. So really thinking about, when thinking about the food security, we need to think about kind of how climate change is affecting the fish that are most needed and most fished in the places where food security is the largest issue. So this figure, this is a little bit, sort of a lot to go into, but generally what I want you to understand from this is that cold water species tend to have lower concentrations of micronutrients. Warmer water species tend to be more dense in, some of the micronutrients that I talked about earlier. They also tend to overlap with the places where micronutrient deficiencies are the highest. So in the tropical latitudes, near the equator, we tend to have some of the poorest places in the world. They also tend to have some of the most micronutrient rich fish. So that's just to say, those are the places that maybe in terms of thinking about food security really need the fish the most, where the stakes may be highest, and where we see in this picture, they're most sort of at risk of losing some of those important fish species. So there has been a lot of documented evidence that fish are moving as the waters get warmer. As I sort of mentioned, this may be because they're moving towards their preferred water temperatures or they're chasing prey. And this may affect the fish species themselves by causing kind of a mismatch in the availability of their prey or the habitat that they prefer. Some of these figures are ones that I've borrowed from researchers who've produced these figures, and some of them are a little bit technical, but this one is basically just showing the way that different fish stocks are moving, and they tend to, it's not sort of universal, but they tend to be moving in the northern hemisphere. Generally, they're moving to the north towards colder waters. And this can cause challenges, in addition to for fishermen, having to adapt to the fish moving. This can cause actually challenges where fish are moving across borders, either between different countries, between different states. Fish obviously don't recognize the same geographical jurisdictional boundaries that we do. So they move to where they want to be. And this is starting to create sort of winners and losers in terms of, countries that are gaining fish versus countries that are losing fish, sort of as we saw in that previous figure. This figure down at the bottom shows the abundance of mackerel catches around Iceland between 2000 and 2010. Just to note that there were very few, and then all of a sudden there were a lot as mackerel sort of moved, and this was attributed to sort of changes in water temperature. But what's important about this is that it led to what were termed the mackerel wars. There was no actual war, but there was sort of a dispute between the UK and Iceland and Norway, where sort of the stock of mackerel had moved into Iceland's waters. Iceland was catching all of these mackerel, and the UK and Norway and other countries were upset because they thought that Iceland was taking sort of their mackerel, causing some, probably some harsh words perhaps between the fisheries ministers. But that's just to show that this was sort of, one early example of how we're already seeing kind of, the potential for disputes between different countries. Here's another example of sort of a fish stock shifting. This is skipjack tuna in the Pacific. This is a very high value, high volume fishery. This is a lot of like the canned tuna that we eat. This is just showing, this red blob on the right. It's just showing that kind of the projected mass of those fish is expected to kind of move to the east across the Pacific. But this may have significant impacts for some countries where I've been working recently, including the Solomon Islands, the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, which really rely very heavily on revenues from fishing fleets for fishing in their foreign nations, essentially fishing in their water. So if those fish are moving out, this is going to have significant revenue impacts for these countries. These fish are both an important source of dietary protein in these countries, but also an important source of revenue kind of for their government. So now I'm going to switch to talk a little bit more directly about a few of the places that I've been working and kind of give some more concrete examples of what this sort of looks like on the ground. So first I'm going to talk about the Gulf of Maine, which is, sort of borders the United States and Canada. It's sort of what's in that black box over there, with Bermuda being down at the bottom, and then it's sort of the coast of New England, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick in Canada. This area in particular has been studied quite a bit because it's warming faster than about 99% of the world's oceans. So when I mentioned that things are not happening sort of at the same rate, this area is warming warming especially rapidly. These lines, the green one sort of shows the average increase in water temperature, and the blue one is meant to be the increase in water temperature at the Gulf of Maine. So you can see that it's, increasing very rapidly. In the recent years, it's had, the warmest surface temperatures on record for that area. And this area is important for a number of different fisheries. One of them is cod. And there's been evidence that the cod fishery in this area has sort of crashed over the last couple of decades. This figure here shows, sort of the point at which it would be considered overfished. And this is where it is, way down here over the last few years. So it hasn't done well, but there's some evidence that part of that is because essentially the waters are getting too warm for cod to be able to reproduce at least at the rate that they used to. And essentially management hasn't really kept up. So fisheries managers, scientists have been assuming, that the cod should rebuild back to the same level that it had been in the 1970s and the 1980s, when it was a highly successful, profitable fishery. And it may be that because the waters are warmer, that's just not feasible. Another example from that area is American lobster, not the lobsters we have here in Bermuda, but the ones with the claws. Maine lobsters, which are, sort of the iconic species of this area, they have had a very different story than the cod in that their numbers have skyrocketed, probably because they prefer the somewhat warmer water. So this blue line shows kind of the landings of lobster. So how many lobster are being caught over the last 3 decades, and it's more than tripled in that time frame. Probably because the lobsters are a little bit happier with the water being slightly warmer, and they've been reproducing a lot faster. The red line shows a more southern stock of lobster, which completely crashed, and that may be in part because the water has actually just gotten too warm for them. So these two regions, although they border each other, they've seen very different sort of responses to climate change. So fishermen, lobstermen in Maine are, they're doing great right now. They're very happy. They're catching tons of lobster, but there's also concern that they will see this same trend of, as the water continues to warm, that it may eventually become too warm there, and that they may be sort of, over-reliant on this one particular species. So sort of moving south geographically to Rhode Island, which is where I'm based in the US. Some of the work that I've done is really thinking about this question about, as fish stocks move and as they change, kind of how do fishermen respond? So thinking about, what are kind of the adaptation strategies that fishermen can have to climate-driven shifts in fisheries, as well as, management responses to climate-driven shifts. They can, as waters warm and fish move, they can chase the fish. They can go somewhere else to fish. They can, switch up the species that they're fishing for and start fishing for something new. They can switch to a different gear type or a different vessel, or they could leave fishing and do something else. So one example of this is this fish, which is called the black sea bass. This is a fish that has been doing really well in this region with climate change. They used to be kind of rare in the Gulf of Maine. Now they're very common. There's all of a sudden a ton of them because they have moved from sort of the mid-Atlantic region of the US and moved north. But the fisheries management hasn't really caught up to this. So fishermen are complaining that, there's a limit, there's a quota on how many they're allowed to take. And the quota is done generally by state, by US states. So the states that are further to the north, their quota is still kind of staying in the same range that it was, maybe 20 years ago when there were not nearly as many fish. So there's a need to kind of rethink the management of this fish species, maybe allow fishermen in the states where the fish are now to fish more and the states where they used to be to fish less. But of course, that, that causes conflict, right, between fishermen in different states. And then likewise, this is a different fish called the summer flounder. I won't go into everything in this figure, but just to say, they've also been moving northward, and the fishermen are, because of the requirements, fishermen were catching them, in one place off of Rhode Island, off of New York, off of Massachusetts, and then taking their boat all the way down to North Carolina, which is, from the top of this, from here all the way down to here to sell them, because that's where the licenses are for, because that's where those fish were formerly most abundant, which doesn't make a lot of sense. This is another example of sort of fisheries management not really being caught up to what's actually happening in fisheries. So, in kind of summary, within the US, we've seen that fisheries management has been really kind of slow to adapt to changes in fish abundance, changes in where the fish are. There's not a lot of the stock assessments, which are what fisheries managers do to kind of estimate how many fish there are. They don't really account for climate change very well. So there's a need to really better think about how to account for climate change and estimating how many fish not only there are now, but how many there will be in the future. And then thinking about, as fish stocks and other species are moving, it creates winners and losers within the different regions. So I'm going to move past that and give you a couple other, shift to a different part of the world. Talking about the United States, that's an area where we have, pretty industrialized fisheries. We have a lot of data. We have, large teams of fisheries managers. But I'm going to move to talking about, a couple other places in the world and sort of the impacts there. So first, I'm going to talk about Madagascar in Africa. So entirely different context. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. It's considered one of the most climate vulnerable nations in the world. There's been massive drought and famine in the southern part of the country, which has caused severe food insecurity. And what's happened here is that a lot of the farmers, they can't farm because of the drought, so they've switched to fishing. And so what's been happening is that that's been creating conflicts between the people who had traditionally been fishing and these sort of new fishers who've come to fish because their farming livelihoods are no longer viable. So it's creating, likely creating overfishing as the number of people doing fishing has increased by a large amount. And it's creating conflict because some of these people who are new to fishing don't sort of know the rules and the cultures and the norms that exist around fishing here. So recently I was in Madagascar and we did some work to try to do do a vulnerability assessment on the value chain for fishing in some of the regions of the country. So here, we don't have all of these models and fisheries data and managers. We're really just sort of starting from the ground to try to think about what some of the problems are. So we're seeing, that climate change is maybe affecting fishery resources like we're seeing elsewhere. There's a high reliance of people on fish for protein, much higher than, in the United States, where I was talking about climate change is going to have habitat impacts on things like mangroves and reefs. But there's a lot of impacts to some of the physical infrastructure in these communities too. For example, heavy flooding, loss of roads. We were working with people from a community where the roads were continually being washed out. So that affects their ability to sort of, if they're catching fish, they can't take them to a market. Some of these fish are being sold, into the capital, but they can't get them to the capital because the roads are washed out. So they can't transport the fish. They're not able to access ice to keep their fish cold. And then they're seeing increased storms, which are preventing access to actually going out fishing. So they're seeing a lot of increased cyclone activity, wind and waves, which actually prevents the fishers from going out to sea, prevents them from making a living, has food security implications, as well as, affecting their livelihoods and their ability to make money. I've been working quite a lot in the Philippines as well. And there we haven't really been focused yet on climate change. There it's really about just kind of creating basic fisheries management. and putting the basic elements of fisheries management in place, which they haven't really had. And once you kind of have some of those basic elements, then you can really start thinking about how to control for climate change, or manage for climate change a bit better. So we've been doing things like helping to create licensing for fisheries so that we can control the amount of fishing effort that's happening, putting closed seasons and protected areas into place, and then helping to build compliance with management, because if you build all of these sort of fisheries management tools, if people aren't, don't follow them or don't care, then they're not really effective. And then we're doing some separate work unrelated to fisheries, but seeing that, the Philippines in general has been, is also highly vulnerable to climate disasters, in particular typhoons and flooding. And we're seeing that people generally have very high levels of climate anxiety, so really concerned about climate change. So I'm working right now on a proposal to think about kind of how to address climate anxiety. So kind of the last case study is we've been also doing some work in a region called the Benguela Current, which is on the west coast of Africa, which covers sort of along the coast of South Africa, Namibia, and Angola, and doing some work with fishers in that region to kind of understand the effects of climate change that they're seeing. And what they're seeing there is changes in weather patterns. So increasing storms, increasing wave heights, stronger currents, more days where they're experiencing fog, and their perception, at least, is that all of these things have increased over, the last 10 or 20 years or so, and that's affecting their ability to go out fishing because they have safety concerns. Either they go out and they can't fish as effectively, or they choose not to go out because it's not safe for them. Bringing in less fish affects their livelihoods, but it also affects, markets in the area. Processing. So there's people who have sort of secondary jobs reliant on fishing. Their livelihoods are also being affected. And then they're also seeing, some of the fish that they're targeting, which are, sardinella, like a type of sardine. They're seeing that the abundance of those fish, which is, makes up the vast majority of what they're catching, is probably decreasing. So I'm going to start to wrap up and talk a little bit about kind of what we can do from here. So thinking about fisheries management, we can't stop climate change. Obviously, it's already here. It's happening. We can do our best to try to control it, but the changes to the ocean they're already happening. So fisheries, in terms of a fisheries management perspective, fisheries managers need to really think about how adaptive management, which is really assuming that the oceans and the fish are not going to stay the same, but adapting as sort of these changes come. So adapting to species on the move, as stocks increase or decrease, allowing fisheries management to be sort of flexible to accommodate for those increases, and sort of think about adapting to the conditions as they change. This might include things like flexibility in what types of fish the fishermen are able to catch, allowing them to target the sort of, we'll call them climate winners, the species that are doing better under climate change or that are showing up in greater abundance, accounting for climate change in fishing stock assessments, and data collection to be able to better account for the effects of climate change. And that fisheries managers also need to think about, managing for what is going to be there in the future. And then, of course, more data is important for kind of tracking the impacts of climate change. Globally, sort of thinking globally about how we manage and protect our oceans. Some of the lessons are that if we promote sustainable fisheries, it will have positive benefits for food security. Better fisheries management can improve climate resilience. So just sort of having fisheries management at all is sort of the first step in having fisheries that are more resilient to climate change, because that can ensure that they're not being overfished. thinking about how to increase the adaptive capacity of fishers and fishing communities. So that might mean giving them other types of livelihoods that they can pursue, allowing them to access different types of markets to make the fishers themselves more adaptive as well. And then finally, keeping in mind that climate change is just one of many environmental stressors, as I mentioned earlier. So while climate change is very important, we also need to think about, pollution and overfishing and development and all these other factors. If we're not addressing those, then we won't be able to successfully build resilient fisheries that are resilient to climate change. Finally, I want to present a couple lessons for Bermuda, which again, and with the caveat that I am not an expert on what's going on here. But just to know, in sort of having some conversations with people, Bermuda is in many ways, as you all know, it's a unique place. But I think even in terms of thinking about climate impacts, it's very unique in that we can't necessarily look to like a neighboring place to see exactly what's going to happen here. Because what is happening in Bermuda is not going to be exactly like anywhere else in the world. There will definitely be impacts to reefs and reef fish from warming waters. In terms of fisheries, pelagic species are very important, and there's sort of a big unknown exactly about how exactly different pelagic species are responding to temperature. And so obviously there's just a lot more, I think there's a lot more research that's needed here. But there has been a big effort to create marine protected areas, and globally they can be a really important tool to addressing climate change, in that they can provide resilience to habitats, to fish populations. They can provide refuge, from some of the other stressors that fish stocks are facing. They can sustain or even in some cases increase fish stocks, and that things like reefs are going to be increasingly, protecting reefs and other habitats is going to be increasingly important under climate change. So marine protected areas can be one way to do that, and that they're also not sort of reliant on a particular fish species, but they have the benefit of protecting many different types of fish. So just to finally wrap up, we're already seeing a lot of the effects of climate change in our oceans on fish stocks. There will be winners and losers, both locally and globally in terms of fish stocks, in terms of places. Climate change will affect fisheries at all scales. So from, the very small scale fisheries to large scale fisheries. And then we need to think about how to do a better job of managing our fisheries in a way that promotes resilience of the fish and of fishing communities and the fishing industry to sustain the economic, social, and nutritional benefits of fish. So with that, I will wrap up. I neglected to put my email address on here, I realize. But, I'll take some questions now, but my email address is smith29@uri.edu. If anyone wants to, reach out, I'd be happy to, for those online or anyone else, I'd be happy to discuss more. So with that, I think I went a little long, but I would love to take some questions.
What's going to be the situation with fishing in international waters? It seems, the destruction caused by industrial scale type operation seems like it's going to get worse because they can pick up and move to wherever. Is there going to be something that changes about jurisdictional rules around international waters? Because otherwise the different countries are going to be at a bigger disadvantage.
Yeah. That's a really good question. And I don't have a great answer to that, but I think it's something that's really important to think about because some countries are starting to think about how to protect their own fishery resources instead of sort of selling them off. But it is an important point to note that those big sort of industrial fishing operations can change the fish or chase the fish rather and move to where they are. So it will be really important to kind of think about how to ensure that some of that fishing activity remains sort of, and that means really, I think, promoting sort of small scale local fisheries.
Just an answer to that one. So the UN Beyond Boundaries of National Jurisdiction treaty is working on a number of marine protected areas to cover high seas in order to provide an insurance policy for that. The Sargasso Sea and the Sargasso Sea Commission that's hosted here is basically the test case. So there are people with responsibility for that are basically trying to create insurance policies for the high seas as well. And the high sea stocks are managed internationally by international bodies. So they're monitoring the quota and allocating quota. So there's management systems in place for the high seas. But what it means is that the traditional fishers, because they're already part of ICAT and they got big dollars to send teams of scientists and lawyers and negotiators to the ICAT meetings, often have the quotas tied up. So the smaller places, they're like, oh, our local stocks are drying up. We want a piece of the international fishing pie, are often getting shut out because they're not a traditional user. So it's much harder for them to get their foot in the door, and developing nations have a much harder time providing the resources to send the sorts of teams that you need in order to, get to the meeting and basically fight for the piece of your pie.
Any way of an adaptation to that typical equation, given the circumstances?
There's been a lot of call for reforms at ICAT and the Pacific and Indian Ocean equivalents. We will see.
In the US, do they have a federal approach to fisheries, or which is probably going to be under fire anyway, but
People have all been fired.
but is there a federal view or management versus just expecting the states to fight it out amongst themselves, given the shifting of the?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting system, and I think a pretty good system, which is complicated. There is sort of management at the federal level of things like the international, tunas and other sort of wide-ranging, highly migratory stocks. There's what are called regional fisheries management councils. So, for example, New England is one region. So there's a council that manages in federal waters, but across the whole region. And then each state is responsible for managing sort of the inshore fisheries within a certain range. So there's a lot of overlapping jurisdictions, which sometimes works out well, but is causing conflicts between regions, between states. And there are bodies that are meant to sort of oversee all of that. But, it's complicated and there are conflicts, and many of those people may be out of a job relatively soon, unfortunately. So we'll see what happens.
Thank you.
Yes.
What sort of data are there on the effectiveness of MPAs, generally speaking, if you can say generally speaking?
That's a complicated question. There's a lot of data, and it's MPAs are sort of range from something that's the size of this room, right, to something that can be like thousands of square miles large. So there's very good data on, the effectiveness of MPAs on habitats, on species that don't move very much. They're very effective at protecting those things. The more something moves, the harder it is to protect, right? So something like a tuna that ranges over, can range hundreds or thousands of miles, it's harder to protect. But what can be important is protecting the habitats that are there, which can provide protection for activities like spawning, protect prey species that are important, things like that. So it's, the details are sort of dependent on the, I would say that the details are very important when it comes to marine protected areas. And they also have a wide range of rules. There are marine protected areas that allow no human activity inside of them. And there are marine protected areas that allow, all types of human activity. So I think the effectiveness really has to do with sort of the management that's actually in place, and then what it's actually protecting. So there are many very good examples of highly effective marine protected areas that are, growing fish stocks. They see spillover, so they see, an increase in the number of fish coming out of the marine protected areas and reproducing inside the area and spilling over and sort of growing the stock. And then there are marine protected areas that sort of they call paper parks, which really have, no effective management in place. So it's really a matter of sort of the details of how well they're being managed and kind of what the objectives are, and how well the design actually matches what the objectives are of the MPA.
So if I could just
Yeah.
turn the question around a little bit, what would you think of a statement that, in general, marine protected areas have been historically ineffective?
I would say ineffective for what? I think it sort of depends on, again, I think it comes down to the objective of what the marine protected areas are designed to do. So in some cases, marine protected areas, when they're designed for, are they designed to increase fish biomass? Are they designed to protect spawning activity? Are they designed to protect coral reefs? Are they designed to promote tourism? These are all sort of different objectives that marine protected areas can have. So I think it's very difficult to make sort of a broad statement about the effectiveness of marine protected areas without looking at the way that they were designed. So I think you really need to kind of match up look at the objectives of each one, and then make an assessment about whether it's effective or not. I think, there are a lot of things that marine protected areas historically have done very well. So, I wouldn't make that statement. Yes.
One of your slides mentioned diversifying livelihoods of fishermen.
Yeah.
Do you have a case study of where that's worked very well, like a success story?
So it's kind of a tricky one because a lot of fishermen, they want to be fishing, right? So often they fish because they love to fish. They're not just doing it for their money, and they're easily happy to work as a bank teller, right? They like being out on the ocean. They like sort of the risk and danger and excitement and adrenaline involved in fishing, right? So there have been a lot of programs to develop alternative livelihoods that have been unsuccessful. Sometimes, some fishermen have gone into, for example, aquaculture. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I think there's a difference between sort of in the development world, they talk about sort of alternative livelihoods, which would be doing something different, versus diversifying livelihoods, which might mean fishing and doing other things, right? So we've seen, in Madagascar, for example, we have had success with seaweed farming. Believe it or not, raising bees for honey has been sort of a successful additional livelihood. Sometimes it might mean finding different markets for their fish. So instead of, fishermen just selling their fish to a wholesaler at the market, it might mean, sometimes getting into different types of markets, whether that's like selling direct to restaurants or hotels and sort of higher end markets where they can make more money with what they're doing. Sometimes it's tourism, like taking people out on, charters or recreational fishing or, ecotourism, those sorts of things. So all of those, there's been examples of where all of those are successful, but it's really the important thing is really kind of understanding what works and what doesn't. And then not all fishermen want to just, are looking to just transition to do something else and figuring out kind of what works for them.
You mentioned on the flip side that there are farmers now with climate change and drought and whatnot looking to fish.
Yeah.
So how was that conflict resolved? And
it hasn't been resolved. That's sort of a relatively new conflict, and that's been sort of very recent that these farmers who aren't able to farm, their farms, went, dried up. So they sort of like took to the sea as a way to make a living and earn some money and get some food. And so there's been a lot of conflict between sort of the fishermen who were already there fishing and these newcomers who are showing up fishing. And there's, conflict in terms of, there's things like closed seasons or sort of norms around, you don't fish in this area, you don't take this type of fish. Some of these are sort of unwritten rules even, but these sort of new fishermen, and I should say they're also migrating from one part of the coast to another. So they're sort of showing up, and there's all the conflicts that you would expect around sort of, they're migrants to a new area. So there's a whole host of conflicts that have shown up around that. And that's new, and we have not been able to address that. It is for sure a challenge. And I think we're likely to see more of that with climate change, not necessarily just in fishing, but, the idea of people migrating because, being driven to migrate because of climate change.
This lady had one. Jamie?
Do you have a question? Oh.
Oh, okay, sorry, they're like, so your hand.
I'm curious, like having just completed as a community the Bermuda Ocean Prosperity Plan, which has yet to be legislated. There's been a lot of discussion and a lot of community voice brought about, I think is a really good thing.
Yeah.
And I imagine you're conscious and aware of that.
Yes.
And I guess we determined as a community that marine protection areas are a way to move forward to ensure there is sustainability in our fisheries. Are there any other things that you think should be considered, need to be considered, or addressed in creating a more sustainable fisheries? And as the gentleman in front of me was suggesting that maybe the marine protection areas have been ineffective, is it concerning to you that we have moved forward with pushing marine protection areas for sustainability in Bermuda?
Could I just interject? That wasn't what I said. I just asked a question. I didn't make any statement about the effectiveness or not.
Sorry. I put those words in your mouth. I do
Yes.
apologize. But it was suggestive, I would say,
Yes.
where you were asking to see if there was an ineffectiveness. And as a community, we have determined that it is an effective approach. Do you question that?
So, I want to caveat this all with saying that I am not from Bermuda. So anything that I say is with a grain of salt. And I know a bit about the process, but I have not been involved in it. I don't know everything. So I would say, I think marine protected areas can be a great tool. I don't think that they should be the only tool. So I think they should be paired with good fisheries management in other ways. I think, as I sort of said earlier, it really comes down to like the objectives and what the intent is of the marine protected area, and whether the design, and that the design includes both sort of where it is, how big it is, what the regulations are, things like connectivity. So you need to have sometimes multiple marine protected areas or a large area so that you can protect enough habitat and space. I think making sure that the design meets the objectives, whatever those objectives are for the community, right? I think that's very important. And then I think engaging the community, engaging the stakeholders, and that includes the fishermen, that includes tourism, that includes, business, that includes everyone, making sure that everyone is on board sort of with what's happening. I think, community engagement is really important. And then I think working with the fishing community on research as well can be really important. So engaging the fishing community in research to, for example, not just putting marine protected areas in place, but then assessing them periodically and finding out if they're working and sort of managing them adaptively. And that could be, monitoring them, seeing our fish stocks increasing. What does the health of the reef look like? And if they're not working, figure out why. Are they in the wrong place? Are they too small? Are they too big? Are they not meeting the right objectives? So it's not just about doing it and being done, but it's about having a plan that is that can be adaptive and can be continually monitored to sort of ensure it continues to meet those objectives.
One of the things I just wanted to understand, because maybe we're different, but I don't think so. You said that one of the key things is to get all those stakeholders on board. I assume you mean with whatever plan it is has been.
Yeah.
Can you give examples of where that's actually occurred? Because one of the things that I've seen here, I don't think anyone would disagree with this, is that there is disagreement in the community, certainly between stakeholders about how to see things. Are there examples where stakeholders have been able, through community voice, to come together and fully agree?
Can I just piggyback on that? That is basically going to be my question is, I'm really interested in success stories.
Yeah.
So success stories of where fishermen and scientists and regulators have really worked well together, and everybody sees the value in each other. You know, regulators see the value of data coming in both from scientists and from fishermen.
Yeah.
And you know, recognizing that fishermen have their own brand of knowledge.
Yes.
So success, yes. Looking for success stories.
So that's a really good question. I think maybe I was a little bit overly optimistic when I said everyone should be on board, because saying that everyone's going to agree is a challenge. But I think first and foremost, it's getting everyone to at least sort of agree, be on the same page in terms of understanding sort of what the goals are, agreeing on the goal, agreeing on the data, sort of the information that's available, and sort of looking at coming at it from the same, you know, having a shared body of information. So that includes, like, you know, the fisherman's knowledge, that includes scientific data, that includes everything else, and sort of having at least everybody have that same access to all the same information, whatever that looks like. That's kind of the first starting point. I'm trying to think of, now that you've put me on the spot, of good examples. I mean, there are certainly examples of marine protected areas that have had the support of the community, and including the fishing community, and the scientific community, and the regulators. I'm not going to say that everyone was on board, but there are some.
The Azores, is that a good example? The Azores recently did the
Yeah.
largest marine protected area.
Yeah, I don't know enough about actually what they've done to kind of know how successful that has been in terms of engagement. So if you know more about that, then
Facilitators were the same facilitators that worked here.
yes,
The process was the same.
Uh-huh.
I know that.
They have EU funding, so they're in a slightly
Yeah.
different position because they have a bigger
Yeah.
funding pool to draw from.
So what's online and presented is not always representative of
Sure.
actual feelings on the ground.
I'll say one example is I've worked a lot in fisheries in New England, and there were several, they didn't call them marine protected areas because that was sort of like a toxic term. Nobody liked that, but they call them fishery closed areas. So it's essentially the same thing, right? So there was a process that I was kind of involved in 10-ish years ago, where the New England Fishery Management Council, which is the body responsible for overseeing, they had closed these areas, and they were doing a review to decide whether they should open those areas, close new areas, et cetera. So part of it was kind of looking at the success of them. And there were two areas in particular that, you know, the fishermen really came to the table and said, like, I fish around this area and I catch a lot of fish near here. And I think that the marine protected area is benefiting the fish stocks in this way. It wasn't universal, right? There were some fishermen who were not in favor of these areas being closed, but there were several who came to these meetings, got up in front of the microphone in front of these fisheries managers and said, like, these areas have been successful. Please keep them closed. They're benefiting. We think that they're benefiting the fish stocks, where we think that they're benefiting habitats. And then there were others that they said, that the consensus was kind of like, these are not doing anything. They're kind of useless. Let's open them up. Let's fish there. So there really was like I think at the time, there were 5 areas and maybe 3 of them stayed closed. 1 of them was eliminated. 1 of them was made smaller. And then there was kind of a new area that was opened. And so that's just kind of an example of bringing science to the table, but also bringing the voices of the fishermen to the table to say, you know, this one is good. This one is not so good. You know, we would really benefit from fishing here. We wouldn't use this area anyway, keep it closed, that kind of thing. So it was really also integrating the voices of the fishing industry into that discussion.
I think we've gone over, which is a good thing, a very good thing. Thank you very much. If you can bear with me a few minutes, just got 3 things to cover. Thank you very much, Sarah. Thinking global, acting local is a key. It's a little ditty, but it's a very sensible one. I especially appreciated you bringing not just the science, but the social science. I think that gets left out of most every presentation. So I think it was really good and much appreciated. So thank you very much for being our final presentation for this series. This is the 7th series, and I want to do a big shout out to Amy Harvey of the Bermuda College and Jennifer Flood of BEST. Worked hard over 7 series in putting these lunch and learn presentations together. I would like to ask, though, if you haven't signed up to become a best friend, i.e. leave us your email address, to please do so before you go, because then we can have you in our system and you can get advance notice about these lunch and learns, because they're getting better and better and better, I think. So thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. And sandwiches, are there still
So there should be
sandwiches outside? But
So I hope so, but just one quick thing. If there's any topic that's burning that you want to know about, drop me an email, aharvey@college.pm, because we're planning the next series. So yeah, let me know if you have a speaker that you want.
And again, any other questions, because this was an enormous amount of great information, and questions will come up. We can use your email address, so
Absolutely.
feel free and make good use of thank you.
Thank you. Oh, no, I'm okay.
Thank you.